Ramaya Rama Bhadraya Ramachandraya Vedase Raghunathaya Nataya Sitaya Pateyi Namaha. Om Shri Ram Jai Ram Jai Jai Ram. So we continue now, and in case there's any confusion, this is the seventh part of the story of Rama. Just to highlight why we reverence Rama so much. So the last time I highlighted some of the great qualities and virtues of Rama, from physical appearance to the divine light that shines behind him. But he was, of course, the seventh incarnation of Vishnu. Now that's a theological concept, because Vishnu means the one that pervades everything. And we assume that if there's an entity that created the world, then there's an entity that destroys it or dissolves it. So projects it, dissolves it, but in between something happens called life. Something there is sustaining it, keeping it alive by pervading. This is a panentheistic position. That is that the whole of what we call life is infused with divinity. And so Vishnu, the one that pervades everywhere, comes from time to time, from age to age, where there is a need for a cosmic balancing power to address the issue of harmony, what we call dharma. This seventh incarnation comes as Rama. Ra can stand for radiance, and Ma can stand for yourself. So if you take this meaning, Rama is the one who is radiant within yourself or within oneself. And so Rama is the indweller actually in everybody. We don't have to necessarily go along with the theology of incarnation if it's controversial. We can take it in this way. Shiva tells Parvati that repetition of the name of Rama is actually equal to the repetition of the Lord's name or a mantra 1,000 times. And so there's an Upanishad dedicated to Rama. In this it says that Rama is a combination of the essence of the Narayana, that is the Ashta Akshara mantra, and Ra, and the Shiva Pancha Aksharama. And others associated with Rama, with the story of Rama, representing people completely devoted to Dharma. That's the important point. We could actually take a philosophical, symbolic review of the story, and we could say that maybe Lakshmana represents the intellect, a symbol of sacrifice. Sugriva represents discernment or discrimination, and Vali will represent despair. Dasaratha can represent the intellect that controls the senses and the organs of action, and his three wives can represent the three gunas, and the four sons can represent the four goals of life. What are the four goals of life? Dharma, artha, that is basis of keeping things together, if you will, in harmony. Artha, that is the moral basis, leads to a moral view of gathering wealth, wealth creation. And then, of course, kama, that is fulfilling desires which are entirely in tune with dharma, but ultimately moksha, freedom, the goal of all goals. We could say that kausalya means someone who is skilled, or the quality of being skilled. And when the five sense organs and the five organs of action are used skillfully, radiance is born within. We can say that the three Rakshasas in the story personify the three gunas. Ravana represents Rajas. We can say that Kumbhakarna represents Tamas. We can say that Vibhishana can represent Sattva. And we can say that Sita can represent purity. We can say that Rama represents Satya or truth, and Dharma, righteousness. So the story of Rama, just to remind you, exemplifies the importance of righteousness in life of a human being. Demons can represent evil propensities, but they're all in you, of course. And because they're in you and all humans, then they are in the world in general. So let us try to pick up from the previous part of the story. We covered the great journey of the river Ganga, or the goddess Ganga, we might say, from the heavens, where she is glorified everywhere. And there are two daughters of Himat. One is Ganga, one is Uma. Ganga is the older one, and roving around with celestial beauty in the area of the Devas. And ultimately, we saw how she managed to come down. She was extremely arrogant and proud because she was flattered by all the Devas. We can understand that. But ultimately, she comes down, threatens the stability of the whole world, and Shiva and so on. But Shiva is unshakable, breaks her fall, and she managed to cover all the three worlds and delight as she goes. So this arrogance is tamed. What we call a flow of energy is nothing but divine grace flowing, which can be diverted toward arrogance, but can also be tamed and be a life giver and give the fruit of grace everywhere a person goes who knows it. So now we go on then to the next section. And this is to do with a small story. And each of these byways of the story gives us a great lesson. What is the lesson of the next section? The lesson is that we are moving in a causal relationship with everything. We cannot have an action that doesn't have a consequence. And a thought is, to all intents and purposes, as good an action as anything else. The next scene that takes place on the way to Mithila, don't forget, they're on the way to Mithila to partake in Janaka's great ceremonial sacrifice, in which he wants to select the best husband, or more accurately, his daughter Sita is going to select the most worthy husband. And so anyway, having moved on, Vishwamitra's party crosses the wide water of the Ganga in a fisherman's boat, and the river blessed them on their way. And on the northern bank of the Ganga, they have come to the gates of Vishala, or Vishala, I should say, more accurately. The city was built with Diti, the mother of the Deities, once sat chanting her very noxious mantras. Mantras are thought movements that can be either blessing or cursing, damaging, or result in a glorious blessing. So these mantras were taught to her by Kashyapa. She prayed for a boy who would kill her sister, that it is Aditi's son, and Aditi's son is the ruler of all the deities, Indra. Now we have to see how Indra has fallen in grace amongst the deities, because the early Vedas praised Indra to the highest, but that was really because much of the sacrificial offerings were to mobilize the forces of rainfall. The weather was inevitably the cause of abundance or otherwise. You have rainfall, you have food. You have no rainfall, you have a drought, then you have no food, and society suffers. So Indra is associated with rainfall, thunder, and so on. But Indra, as a personified entity, falls out of grace many, many times in the story. And Diti became pregnant by Kashyapa's seed, but the vow she had sworn was exacting. And exacting means, well, 1,000 years of perfect purity, even during her pregnancy. it was seen and is still understood that the 9 months of pregnancy requires a pure movement of thought, and that has its effect on the baby. Only one day after she had bathed, Diti fell asleep with her head on her knees and the tips of her hair brushing her feet, and Indra had waited like a serpent for this moment's lapse of attention, and he flashed into her womb through her nostril and cut her child in 7 pieces with his diamond thunderbolt. Yet he's associated with the thunderbolt, lightning, rainfall. But he couldn't extinguish life within those pieces, and the 7 pieces began to wail aloud inside their sleeping mother, and Indra cut each of the 7 pieces in 7 again. But they still howled, and in despair the Deva hissed at them, Ma Ruda, don't cry, don't cry. And Diti awoke, shaking, and she knew what had happened, and Indra said to her, your vow protected your children. Even my Vajra, my thunderbolt weapon, could not kill them. So here, take them. There are 49 now. But Diti realized that now her sons could never kill the Deva king, and she said to Indra, well, fate has decided that evil won't befall you. You take these sons of mine and let them be your brothers. And so Indra, he takes these splendid children, and he takes them and incorporates them among the Devas, and they become companions to Vayu. For whatever Indra whispered to them in their mother's womb, they also became the Maruts, that is, the other natural forces, winds. Actually, Maruts are the sons of the Vayu, of winds. So anyway, we go on in the story, and after we'll move on from Vishala, and we're on the way to Mithila. Now, on the way, on the outskirts of Mithila, and grander than Vishala, glowing silver and gold is described, jewels embedded in her walls. The city's towers and ramparts stroke the sky. This is wonderful poetry from Valmiki. So we can imagine the scene. Kshatriyas and Rishis were full of wonder. Kshatriyas, the military caste, Rishis, the Kshatriyas, administrative sages at their highest, and the Rishis, the contemplative sages. And Rama pointed to a small grove of fruit trees with an auspicious air, and at its heart was an ashram in seclusion. It was a beautiful atmosphere there. And so Rama asks Vishwamitra, well, whose is this ashram? Clearly it's an ashram with ancient trees, but why does it stand such a beautiful place? Why is it deserted? And with a light in his eye, a sparkle in his eye, Vishwamitra says, well, if you think this ashram is beautiful now, in its heyday, you should have seen it when the great Maharshi Gautama sat in meditation under its trees. And Rama's, this place was like a bit of heaven fallen into the earth in those days. Now Gautama's tapasya, or his spiritual direction of his will, was so profound, so deep, that Brahma created a woman called Ahalya of unequal beauty and gave her to Gautama to be his wife. You can see how tapasya is seen to be a discipline of all the senses, a thought movement, and resulting in the beautiful effects of your meditation. And Ahalya comes when we see that it is a gift from Brahma we have to apply a little cosmological philosophy and understand that this is the cosmic mind working. Anyway, for years, these two, they lived happily together. But one day, Indra saw Ahalya and was smitten by her. Now, we have to understand that Indra not only is in relation to the cosmic forces, lightning and life and so on and so forth, but also on the microcosmic level, is also in charge of all the indriyas, that is the sense organs. Because devas or deva means an illuminating factor. All right, in the stories they get personalized, that's to make a story. But actually the inner meaning is indriyas, and the chief of all the indriyas would be the mind itself. And the mind can be in our favor, can be noble and virtuous, or it can be damaging and dark. And so lust enters into Indra's mind, or Indra is the mind, and Ahalya, and he was smitten by her beauty, and Gautama went to the river for his evening bath. This Indra, king of the Devas, assumes the rishi's form, takes on the form of Gautama himself, and comes to Ahalya. Now, she knew him at once, she recognized him as Indra, but she became flattered at his advances. And so she was flattered that Indra, such an important deity, would desire her. And she allowed Indra to make love to her on the very floor of the ashram where she slept every night with her husband. And when the passion was satisfied, Ahalya became alert and sensible to the danger and worried, oh, maybe Gautama will return here all of a sudden. And she cried to Indra, go quickly before my husband returns. Now, this kind of plot you can see in many, many soap operas and dramas today, because it's really a part of human life. This unfaithfulness happens, and it all comes from the mind itself. Anyway, in his arrogance and in his easy attitude, he says, no, he won't finish his bath and his worship so soon. And so he re-engages in his lovemaking, and Ahalya couldn't resist his caresses. And so this drama unfolds, and they come dangerously close to discovery. The brief time of love is a long while, and when they were satisfied, Indra himself realizes that he should now leave. But it was too late. And just as the Indra had prepared to go out with the last embrace, Gautama stood at the door and was astonished, stared in amazement at someone who looked exactly like himself. And this doppelganger, this duplicate Gautama, was holding Ahalya, his wife, in his arms, but he knew at once who it was. And Indra, the great king of the Devaloka, the place of the Devas, stood revealed before the Rishi. But Gautama wasn't moved. In a terrible voice, the sage Gautama, whose words will always ring true, cursed this Deva, Indra. Your vanity, that no woman can resist your charms, made you commit this heinous crime. So let your charms be seen by everybody in the world from today, 1,000-fold. Let your body be adorned with 1,000 phalluses all over your body, so everyone knows your real nature. You'll be humiliated, even amongst all the deities. In other words, you cannot escape the effects of your actions. And they will be publicly known. The effects will be disastrous to you. Anyway, reeling from this curse, Indra flees, and already he feels the 1,000 appendages of shame pushing the lewd way out through his skin. And thus the Deva king was called Satakritu, that is, he was humiliated by virtue of this name. Then the sage turns to his erring wife. It's her turn. And heartbroken, Gautama curses his wife Ahalya in their hut. He tells her, describes, okay, living on air, you shall stay here, unseen by anyone. And after a long time, what will happen is Dasarata's son will pass this way. And when he sets foot in this ashram, you'll be freed from the curse. What is the curse? The curse is that she crumbles to dust on that very floor. So you have betrayed your womanhood, be as dust on the ground, he says. And she cries out in anguish, with tears in her eyes. And because of this, the Maharshi looked at his wife and knew he couldn't curse either her or himself forever. And so he says, in the Treta Yuga, these yugas are vast, vast eras. But in the Treta Yuga is when Rama is supposed to arrive. And Vishnu, the all-pervading one, will be born as a prince of this earth. And when his holy feet touch this floor, you now become, and you will be forgiven. You'll be restored. And before his eyes, she turned into dust on the floor of the ashram where she had betrayed him. And Gautama vanishes from the place, never to be seen again. And that is why the ashram is completely abandoned. Now again, what is the magic of Rama, whose feet transforms this dust back into the beautiful Ahalya again? Again, we come back to the original statement I made in this part, that is Rama, who's the 7th incarnation of Vishnu. Now, all the entourage, Vishwamitra, Rama, Lakshmana, they stand at the threshold of this ashram. And Vishwamitra pushes the door and it creaks open, door of the building. And with his hands, he clears out the cobwebs and from the ceiling, the wall, and all the thick lattices and so on. And he let in the light of the sun into the building. And like a weapon to end the darkness of centuries that lay, congealed within this room. And he calls Rama, come, come, see where Ahalya was made dust by her husband Gautama's curse. And handing his bow to his brother, come on, you handle this, Rama crosses over the threshold, past Vishwamitra, and into this deserted building. And following all the shafts of the sun coming in, Rama goes into Gautama's ancient home, and he himself became another profound light. And even if he didn't know it yet himself, or anything about his divinity or his specialness, and Vishwamitra stands at the door, not wanting to be the first one inside, because that's not what will happen. The first one has to be the transforming one. The instant the prince of Ayodhya steps into that hut, there was a flash like soft lightning in the gloom. A woman whose beauty belonged to another age of the earth, namely Ahalya, who was like a sudden flame in a cloud of smoke, like the sun on clear water, stood before an astonished Rama. And her hands are folded in salutation, and her eyes are shining. And then beside the first flash of spirit light that Ahalya had stepped into, there was another deeper radiance shone. With a rapturous smile on his face, the sage Maharshi Gautama reappears. And just like in a dream, and he prostrates himself at the feet of the Rama, and Ahalya also touches Rama's feet, kisses his feet, and then kisses her husband's, and his eyes are brimming full, and Gautama raises her up, embraces her in complete forgiveness and forgetfulness of the previous crime. So the effects will last some time, but they are commensurate with the crime. And we all have room for forgiveness in the heart, for a temporary lapse, a momentary lapse, which is difficult for us. And surprising himself, Rama raised his palms that were suddenly alight and blesses Gautama and Ahalya. Hand in hand, they walked around, and as though he was a sacred fire, as in a kind of renewal of marriage vows, and Ahalya joined her to her husband. They vanished into the twin condescence from the world and from time of their moment. And only Vishwamitra saw the shower of barely tangible petals from the realm of the Devas, and perhaps the contrite king, their contrite king, Indra, may have also showered petals. And those petals, whose transcendent sweetness filled that hermitage, maybe he experienced that. So this is the story of Ahalya. It's a significant story. And the story is told by Valmiki, of course, but these stories are actually in other Puranas and other popular stories with slightly varying versions of this. But the differences, they don't have to trouble us at this point. Now, just a word to those of who read the story of Rama and Bharata and other Puranas. In these works, there are frequently references to these Devas and Rakshasas. The Rakshasas are the wicked. They have no regard for Dharma and reveled in evil deeds. But we have to understand these are aspects of the human condition. Asuras were also like Rakshasas, but even among Rakshasas, there were a few wise and virtuous people. And there spring up bad men, even in the best of races, and vice versa as well. And on the whole, Asuras and Rakshasas were those who rejoiced in doing wicked deeds. And it's a pity that some people in their ignorance identify these two things, Asuras and Rakshasas, with ancient Indian tribes and races, a view that is not supported by any literary work or any tradition in recorded history. But there are conjectures that have made some confusion in this, that Rakshasas were the Dravidian race and not born out of any authority in Tamil or other literature. And the Tamil people are not descendants of Asuras or Rakshasas, but people are still fighting over this north-south divide in India today. In fact, the Devas were generally upholders of Dharma and took on themselves the task of putting down the Rakshasas, generally, and according to the Puranas, that section of literature to do with stories for ease of understanding the profound philosophies, they had at times to deviate from Dharma in dealing with the Rakshasas, some of whom had attained great power through tapas. Tapas would generate siddhis or powers. And the Devas were generally good. Those among them who swerved from the path of righteousness paid the price for it, as we have seen. There was no real separate code of conduct for the Devas, because the law of cause and effect, sowing and reaping, that we call karma, admits no distinction between the Devas and the others. So even if the Devas do something, there's still the effect comes in. The laws dealt with the Devas as with others. And along with this, wedded to virtue as the Devas generally were lapses on their part, and they appear big to us, like stains on white cloth. But the Rakshasas' evil deeds are taken for granted. They don't attract much attention. It's only the exception that attracts great attention, like stains on a black cloth. The honest, when they happen to go astray, as happens, should evoke our sympathy. We should have compassion because they are suffering and they will suffer. And it's the way of the world. It's not right to condemn in strong terms casual lapses of the virtuous while tolerating habitual wrongdoers, taking it for granted. That's their nature. So we should take note that in the Puranas we see these devas, wrongly called gods, by the way, really, getting entangled in dilemmas of dharma, even if they consider them as rulers in subtle parallel universes or something like that, or other dimensions. Still they're part of the phenomena of life. And we see all these deities getting entangled in dilemmas of dharma, matters of conscience. Indra and other devas are shown often as committing very serious sins. So the next question, why did the sages who told the Puranas involve themselves in such difficulties? Why did they tell such stories? Well, their aim was to awaken people to a sense of the dangers of the opposite, the dangers of adharma, the thing that will bring about a disunity, a disharmony, a disruption, a lack of peace. We have to understand this is a dimension that we have to deal with. And so it's important to highlight both sides of the coin. So their aim was to awaken people to the sense of danger, and or else the sages need not have deliberately attributed sinful acts to their own heroes and created difficulties for themselves. And some people take great pleasure in jumping to wrong conclusions from the incidents in the Puranas. And so some may argue Ravana was a very good king. Valmiki has falsely accused him of wicked deeds. And they might ask, didn't Rama act unjustly on a certain occasion later on the story? Didn't Sita utter a lie? And all of those kinds of the like. And Valmiki could well have omitted incidents which are not very edifying, but he includes them. And both Rama and Ravana were first presented to us by the poet Valmiki. And there wasn't any earlier work referring to Ravana that can be quoted to contradict him and maybe to put a stamp on him or on the story as being partial to Rama or Sita and partial to the Devas and a twisting of facts to deceive people. No, Valmiki's Ramayana is the fountain source of the story of Rama. And in it, we can come across seemingly wrong deeds as well as good deeds, a mix in realism. So we have to consider this episode a calm consideration of these kinds of mix of situations that would show that they're just portraying similar difficulties in our day-to-day life. And it is for our benefit to learn from the moral trials contained in them. The lesson of the Ahalya episode is, in fact, that however deadly one's sin is, however shocking, one can hope to be freed from its consequences by penitence and by taking on the effects of your actions. So instead of condemning others for their faults and failings and sins, we should look within our own hearts and try to purify in our own hearts of every evil thought. The best of us have need for eternal vigilance if we would escape sin. And this is really the moral of Ahalya's era. Now let's go to Mithila. So the party enters King Janaka's Mithila that we have described beautifully, with jewels and so on. We get some idea of this if you see buildings such as the Taj Mahal, which from some people's point of view was not a memorial, but was originally a royal palace. And we can see how it is inlaid, replaced now, but how it used to be inlaid with jewels, with gold, with silver, sparkling in the sunlight. So they walk up to the enclosure where the yajna is being held. 1,000 Brahmins are there, all experts on the Vedas, and they're all gathered there for the sacrifice. It was a big thing. And of course, they were housed in 1,000 dwellings, big expense. And these dwellings were built within the vast precinct of the Yajnashala, a kind of mini city. We get some kind of idea of the vastness of such an event when we go to some of the pilgrimage places that happens from time to time in India. Anyway, Vishwamitra, he chooses a spot near a tank of clear water and at the heart of Mithila, and he and his party settle themselves under a peepal tree. Peepal, a kind of, a tree that is sacred. The peepal leaves, they go broad and they come to a point, beautiful leaves, said to be sacred. And in his palace, Janaka hears of Vishwamitra's arrival, actually, and immediately he comes at once to greet the rishi, as would be the custom. And he has heard that about Vishwamitra from his own guru, Gautama's son, Sadananda. Janaka prostrates himself before the great sage who had come to his city. So he says, my yajna is thrice blessed that you have come to Mithila. Now I am sure that all the forces of nature that we can unfortunately call or translate as gods will give me what I want. 12 days remain to the conclusion of this yajna. Vishwamitra, you must stay with us until the end. You must be here when the devas come for their share of the prasad, if you will. Now, even as he spoke, the king's eyes strayed, and he strays to Rama and Lakshmana, and he can't contain himself. He asks, well, who are these young men? He's thinking now, maybe these are suitable men. And they seem to be as strong as the devas themselves, as handsome, and truly, it is of such kshatriyas, the ancients said that, seeing them, even men wished they were women. And Muni, that is the silent one, Vishwamitra, tell me all about these brothers, for brothers they must be, because they look so much alike. My heart longs to know everything about them. Vishwamitra says, well, these are Rama, this is Lakshmana, and they are the sons of King Dasaratha of Ayodhya. But before I tell you how they killed Tataka and Maricha's Rakshasas, let me tell you about a wonderful miracle. When Rama walked into Gautama's ashram, and that was abandoned, you must know, it's close by, Ahalya rose from the dust, and Gautama himself appeared there. They were united again. Janaka, the Kshatriyas, have come to look at Shiva's bow. Now a cry escapes Sadananda. Ahalya was his mother. And so he bows deeply to Rama. You have freed my mother from her long death. I salute you. You, Rama of Ayodhya, please be welcome to Mithila. It is not for nothing that Vishwamitra himself came to call you out into this world. Then Sadananda told the story of Vishwamitra's life to the gathering under the old people tree, and saying he did so for posterity because he knew the Brahmarshi, Vishwamitra himself, would never speak of his own achievements. And as Sadananda unfolded his tale, Vishwamitra sat among the absorbed gathering. His eyes seldom left Rama's dark face, bluish, face. In art, it's portrayed as blue, same as Vishnu, representing eternity. And at times, a faint smile flickers on his lips. And so we can imagine the scene that twilight falls in the garden at Mithila, and not the princes of Ayodhya, Vishwamitra's rishis, or King Janaka. None of them stirred when occasionally Ahalya's serene sun paused. And encouraged by their eager silence, Sadananda continues. Darkness fell and lamps were brought out to them by the king's, that's King Janaka's servants. And it was late when the Brahmana finished his extraordinary tale. Janaka returns to his palace with his guru, Vishwamitra's munis, and the brahmacharis themselves stretch out under the peepal tree. We say the Brahma Rishi, Vishwamitra stretched himself out under the peepal tree, listening to the silence. Can we listen to silence? Yes. Because silence is the absence of any noise or disturbance. That is where we find our most inspiring moments and reality itself. He listens to the silence. You can imagine the rich breeze and the tidings they bore from distant parts, and they all soon fell asleep. Now only Rama and Lakshmana were still awake, and you can imagine they might have watched the moon rise near midnight and were lost in a reverie of Vishwamitra's astonishing life. Now we can see how the king, who had said that the prince is welcome to see the bow, we come now to seeing, remembering that the whole point of the gathering is to display the heirloom, which was Shiva's bow, bestowed by Varuna himself to King Janaka. And here's the test. So with the early sun, Janaka comes back to Vishwamitra and his party. The king said, well, you see, through the night, I have thought about your presence in my city at this auspicious time. I feel much more certain than ever that you've come with a blessing for me. So command me, my lord, how may I serve you? And Vishwamitra replies, well, perhaps you're right, I don't know. And I have come to you with a blessing, no doubt. But these principals here of Ayodhya, who are master archers, have come to look at Shiva's bow. So let the Ayuta be fetched out. It may be that your fortune, like your ancestors, is still bound to it. And Janaka sat down with them and he said, well, before we look at Shiva's bow, let me tell you how I came to have it. You see, my house is called Videha, and Nimi was a great Kshatriya in our line. And after him, the sixth king in olden times was Devarata. And it was Devarata that this bow was first given, and he was told to keep it safely. Now it happened in the days when Shiva's father-in-law, Daksha, held his infamous yajna. And it was during this infamous yajna that he invited either his daughter Sati or Shiva, but Sati went anyway. And she didn't want to be Daksha's daughter anymore. and raising the inner fire of yoga in her body, she made ashes of herself, you remember? And the devas, the cosmic forces, all watched in horror and in terror also, because their vanity had all come to Daksha's sacrifice. They were all there thinking we are important guests. And when Shiva arrives at that yajna with his army of ganas, creatures, you see Shiva's companions are those nobody else wants. The hunchbacked, the cripples, all the bhutas, the ghosts, all the creatures that nobody else wants. Shiva says, come, I'll take you on. And he came with his bow in his hand to kill Daksha and the devas. Why did he do this? Because he was insulted. Sati couldn't take it, burned herself to ashes as a result, putting Shiva into a great deal of grief. And he said, Sati burned herself while you watched. You did nothing to intervene. And I'll put your jeweled heads from your bodies now. But they fell at his feet, and Mahadeva, that is Shiva, is easily pacified, for his heart is full of compassion and kind. You have to remember that in churning the cosmic ocean, Vishnu agrees, in order not to make a big hole in the observable universe by churning this Mount Meru, he agrees to put it on his back in the form of a tortoise. And but then you see, with this churning comes out poison that is going to threaten the whole of existence. The churning is a corporate effort from the forces of Indra on the one side and Vritra on the other side, because this whole universe is churned in this way. One movement this way is adjusted by a movement that way. That's how we maintain a balance. But out of this comes creation. Good things come out, bad things also come out. How to save the world that will be inundated with this poison? Shiva says, oh, don't worry, I'll take this poison. I myself will drink it. And he leaves a blue mark in his throat as a result. Anyway, he forgave the devas because of his compassion and gave Daksha a goat's head in place of the one Virabhadra had hewn from his neck. And it was at that time, as if he didn't trust himself in his terrible grief, that Shiva gave his bow for safekeeping to my ancestor, says Janaka, who was Devarata. And ever since that time, the bow has been with us. We've guarded it as our most precious treasure, the root of our fortune. Anyway, now he pauses in his story and glances at Vishwamitra, the rishi, who knew the best part of the king's story was yet to be told, smiled to encourage him. Anyway, Janaka brightened as if a hope he held dear had been confirmed, and he resumed slowly. And he had arrived at the heart of his tale. So the king of Mithila said, you see, here's the heart of the tale. Here's the crux of it. Some years ago, I was turning the earth for another yajna. And suddenly, before my golden plow, I saw a child laying on the ground like a piece of the moon. Now, you know where this story is going, because in the last part, I mentioned, and probably even previously, how Sita is found or discovered or born. She lay smiling at me, and my heart wouldn't be still until I had brought her to my wife, and we decided to raise her as our daughter. Janaka's face lit up. We called her Sita. We called her Sita because we had found her in a furrow at the head of the plow. And we soon realized she wasn't an ordinary child. And her devotion to her adopted parents, her uncanny knowledge of people, her compassion, her gentleness and grace, and not least Muni, her beauty, these are scarcely of this mortal world. Now he stopped again and for an instant stared straight at Rama. That prince's heart was on strange fine fire that he had never known before in his young life. And he looks away in mild confusion, while Vishwamitra had a smile. Now, in the tone of sharing a secret, Janaka continues. See, to tell you honestly, my friends, in Mithila, we think of Sita as an incarnation, an avatara. And if Rama, this is my side, if Rama is an incarnation from Vishnu, then we know the other side of the coin has to be Sita. So we think of Sita as an avatara of who? Well, of Lakshmi. If Rama is an avatara or incarnation or a descendant of Vishnu, then his consort is Lakshmi. And never before has this kingdom known such prosperity as we have since we found her. If she's Lakshmi, she has brought abundance and prosperity to the kingdom. And they saw his eyes grow moist as he spoke of Sita. He says, I decided she would only marry a prince who is worthy of her. And we prayed that such a person, such a man might come to her someday. Meanwhile, so many princes, so many royals, so many warriors, so many kshatriyas have come to Mithila wanting to marry her. But I refused them. I refused them all, and Sita also refused them. And in fact, one angry king cried out to me, to whom then, Janaka, will you give your daughter? And without thinking, Janaka replied, to the man who can lift Shiva's bow and string it. And 100 kshatriyas came to attempt this. None of them could move the bow from where it lay, let alone pick it up. And at one time, an alliance of kings brought a great army and surrounded my city. And how could I withstand such a force on my own? And so I prayed to all the cosmic forces of nature that we call Devas, and they sent a host from heaven because I was the guardian of Shiva's bow. And how swiftly that battle was concluded. And the Kshatriyas fled from the astras of the gods, the weapons, celestial weapons. And yes, quite a tale hangs regarding this bow of Shiva. Then he arose and took Rama and Lakshmana by the hand. Come to my palace, and I will have Shiva's bow fetched for you to see. And so just within the palace gates, the bow was displayed so that everyone who passed could look at it. It was kept in an iron casket, and it was worshipped actually as a holy object with incense and flowers and mantras during the 3 sandhyas of the day, the 3 periods where a devotional attitude should take place, namely morning, mid-morning or midday, I should say, and evening time. 3 auspicious times to do ritualistic worship. So Janaka leads them to the palace arena, festive with flags, garlands, and banners for the yajna, and already thousands of people had streamed into it from far and near for the sacrifice. And when his most recently arrived guests were seated with honor, Janaka clapped his hands to his guards to bring the bow. And in its great casket, Shiva's bow was wheeled in, and it lay on a low golden cart, glimmering with jewels. 100 strong men pulled on the massive ropes that dragged the cart of 8 wheels. This was Shiva's bow with which he had threatened the Devas. And the crowd rose up. A vast murmur of Om Namaha Shivaha was heard, like an ocean wave in that stadium. Janaka went to Vishwamitra and bowed to him to show that the Rishi was the most revered person present. And the king then said aloud, Brahma Rishi Vishwamitra, here lies the bow of Mahadeva, that is Shiva, which has broken the pride of many a royal person, many a kshatriya. No deva, no god, no angel, no Gandharva, no celestial being, no Asura even, or great Naga, any number of powerful beings has been able to lift this bow. Not through all the ages, ever since Shiva gave it to my ancestors. And so the gods flung back the casket's cover, and the jewels on that weapon shone brightly. They shot livid shafts of color through the day, and the crowd gasped. What a wondrous sight. And Vishwamitra turns to Rama at his side. The prince was a little tense, has a bowstring himself, somebody familiar with stringing bows. He was a little skeptical. But softly the Rishi assured him, Rama, my child, go and look at Shiva's bow. Just look at it. And a hush fell on the crowd. You can imagine the scene when Rama rose. Rama was radiant. The unworldly color of gentle blue, color of infinity. And he crosses gracefully to the casket. For a moment, he stands just looking at this bow. Then a smile lit his face, a moment of inspiration, and he says, Muni, silent one, that is Rishi, may I touch the bow? And Jana cries, well, of course. What else have you come for? And Vishwamitra nods to Rama, seeking his permission at every step of the way. And the prince leaned forward and stroked the great weapon with his fingertips. Vishwamitra whispered to Janaka, ask him if I can lift it. Janaka shot the Rishi a doubtful glance. He was afraid lest this prince couldn't lift Shiva's bow. For suddenly his heart was set on giving his precious Sita to Rama and no one else. But Vishwamitra insisted, bristling his brows at the king. And then Rama himself turns and says in a clear voice, I think I can lift the bow and string. May I try? Now we have to see what is the significance. We are all faced with challenges. We're all faced with a test of strength. And if we acknowledge that Rama is in fact our own inner self, full and free and perfect, that is where all our strength will come from. If we think we are ordinary people. I was once in London, somebody said to me, my host said to me, it's okay for you Swamis, you're extraordinary. I said, no, you're all extraordinary. Every one of you is extraordinary in your own way. You have to find it out. So understanding your spiritual nature gives you unlimited potential, infinite possibilities, infinite strength. And no object, no difficulty is too big when we resort to our divine nature. So Rama says in a very clear voice that is confident, I think I can lift the bow and string it. May I try? And a great intuition of destiny sweeps over the people. The crowd was on its feet, ready for some kind of unusual experience. Well, you may, cried the king and the sage together. Both of them said, and effortlessly, imagine, effortlessly, as if it was his own weapon that he carried on his back every day, Rama picked up Shiva's bow from his casket, and the crowd sighed, and calmly the prince bent the bow and strung it. And a thunder flash exploded in his hands, and the earth shook, and most of the people fell down stunned. Shiva's awesome bow had snapped in two. Not only was it strung, but it snapped. Smiling faintly, Rama placed the pieces back in the casket Oh, I broke it. Let me put it back. You can imagine. Now, here's the thing. Not only can we do whatever we like, or not only is there unlimited inner strength in us, but we can assert it. We are politely asked, may we do it? We can assert it confidently. But when we tackle it, we see it can be done effortlessly. All spiritual life, in fact, all obstacles that we encounter, that we find firstly an inner resistance toward, we access our own inner strength, and then we discover we effortlessly do it. Why? Because struggle and effort, if we register it to our own individuality, creates itself an obstacle. But if we let go and release and allow the divine within us to act and do, as it were, then everything happens effortlessly and the obstacle gets removed. And the obstacle is always a sacred obstacle. It is for our own growth, for our own good. What a wonderful thing it is. So then Janaka ran forward and embraced him again and again. And then he hugged Lakshmana and said, with tears in his eyes, and he bowed over and over to Vishwamitra, who had brought Rama to Mithila. Janaka cried to the deist crier, the prince of Ayodhya has done what no other Kshatriya could. I'm delighted to give my daughter Sita to him. There's no warrior in heaven on earth or earth like Rama. And he named, he turns to Vishwamitra and says, my lord, may I send messages to Dasaratha to ask him to come to Mithila so Rama and Sita can be married as soon as possible. Vishwamitra glanced at Rama. He saw joy brimming on the prince's face, and he says, do so, Janaka. Let the news fly to Ayodhya. Within the hour, the king's messengers set out on the swiftest horses in Mithila's royal stables. Now, this is all on the side of Janaka, Rama, and so on. But what about Sita? Well, from her room high up in Janaka's palace, she has seen Rama when he came, and she had prayed he would string the bow. And she had lost her heart the moment she set eyes on him. It was this prince she had always dreamed of and waited for. And she knew him from long ago, from countless lives before. And they had belonged together since time began. And so her heart also leapt for joy. And the memory would necessarily, ultimately have gone back. Yes, I am the avatara of Lakshmi, and Rama is the avatara of Vishnu. And this is the cosmic drama being played out by both of us. So with this end of this part, thank you. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. The next Saturday that we have, I will go on to conclude that story. We go on to the next part, where Dasaratha comes to Mithila. All right.